He thought the silence meant surrender. The ballroom at Leighton Hall glittered like a wound that refused to close. Crystal chandeliers, white orchids, a string quartet playing soft enough to hide cruelty. At the center of it all, Adrian Vale stood beside his new wife, the model everyone in the city was pretending to admire, while Elise, his ex-wife, the woman who had signed the divorce with tears staining the paper, was asked to smile for the cameras like she had never mattered at all. Someone in the front row laughed too loudly. Someone else lifted a glass. Then Adrian, with that polished cruelty she knew better than her own reflection, said, "You always did look best when you were trying not to cry." The room smiled with him. Elise did not. Her hands were empty, but not shaking. That was the first thing people always misunderstood about her. They mistook stillness for defeat. 3 years ago, she had been the wife who held the house together while Adrian built his name on her patience. She remembered the unpaid bills hidden under cookbooks, the nights she skipped dinner so he could take clients out, the way his fingers loosened from hers the moment success began to arrive. And the final memory, the one that still lived under her ribs like cold iron, was the afternoon she signed the divorce papers while his assistant stood by the door and his mother called her unfortunate, in a tone meant to sound charitable. Tonight was supposed to be their victory lap. Instead, it became the first crack in the glass. A waiter brushed past Elise and nearly knocked the champagne flute from her hand. She steadied it without looking down, and in that tiny motion the room seemed to notice her for the first time. Adrian's new wife, all angles and diamonds, leaned closer to him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Is she here for the gift table?" she murmured, and another wave of laughter rippled through the guests. Elise felt the old humiliation rise, familiar, bitter, obedient, and then she let it pass through her like smoke. She had learned, in the years after the divorce, that pain could be survived, but being seen as breakable could become a prison. So she made no scene. She only lifted her gaze, met Adrian's with a calm so sharp it almost cut, and said, "You should be careful what you celebrate in public." It was soft. It was polite. It landed harder than a slap. For a second, the ballroom went strangely still. Adrian's smile faltered, just once. That was enough. Because tonight wasn't only about being humiliated. It was about being counted out. Outside these walls, Elise had built a life he never bothered to imagine, one careful decision at a time, one locked door, one signed document, one secret kept alive in silence. And somewhere beyond the chandeliers and the lies, 3 lives she had protected with everything she had were about to step into the light. Adrian had married a model to prove he had moved on. He had no idea the real loss had already begun, and that the woman he tried to shame was no longer standing here alone. She was standing at the edge of a story he could no longer control. The elevator doors opened on a corridor washed in white gold, and the silence inside it felt expensive. Elise stood there in a black coat that no longer fit the woman Adrian had abandoned. It hung on her like a promise. In her hand was a sealed envelope from the family lawyer, thin as paper and heavier than a verdict. She had already signed the divorce. That was done. Final. Clean. But the next line in the letter was not clean at all, a private summons to a sealed reading of Adrian's new marital trust, where every name would be heard aloud, and every hidden obligation would become public. Adrian's model wife had been smiling for cameras all week, certain that beauty had won what loyalty never could. Elise did not smile. She read the invitation once, then folded it with slow, exact fingers. The 3 children she had protected were no longer a secret she could carry forever. The moment someone tried to place them in the wrong hands, the lie would collapse. At the lobby desk, the clerk looked up and went still, recognizing her only as the woman from the divorce filing. Elise asked for a pen, not because she needed to sign anything, but because she intended to add her own name to the room that had erased her. Across the city, Adrian was preparing another performance, another proof that he had moved on. He had no idea the trust he thought protected his new life was built on a clause he had never read, and that tonight would force him to choose between the woman he married for image and the family he had already lost. When the black car arrived, Elise stepped in without hesitation. Not to beg. Not to accuse. To let the truth breathe for the first time in years. And somewhere in a quiet apartment, 3 small lives waited in sleep, untouched for now, but no longer safely hidden from the world. The first door had closed on her marriage. The next one would open on her power. The rain had started before midnight, thin as wire against the black glass of the car. Inside, no one spoke. Elise kept her hands folded in her lap, her wedding ring absent, her posture still. Adrian sat across from her like a man already regretting the shape of his own silence, while the model beside him stared out the window, perfect and pale, as if beauty could outrun consequence. Then his phone lit up. One message. 2 words. Come home. He read it once, and the color drained from his face. Not because of the text. Because of the name beneath it. Margaret. The woman he thought would stay broken, hidden, manageable, had just sent for him with the authority of someone who had found the missing key to his life. Elise saw the change instantly. Her gaze moved to the trembling phone, then to the road ahead, where the city blurred into gold and ash. For years, she had begged for respect in rooms that gave her none. Tonight, she said nothing. She only reached into her coat and placed an envelope on the seat between them. Inside was a legal notice, already signed, already delivered, already irreversible. Adrian's jaw tightened as he opened it. The first line hit him harder than any accusation: custody review. Not for the marriage. For the children he did not know existed. His throat worked once, empty. What did you do? He whispered. Elise did not answer him. She looked past him, toward the dark road, where 3 small sleepers waited under a stranger's roof, safe for one more night and no longer invisible. The car slowed at a red light, then stopped completely, and in that trapped, humming silence, Adrian finally understood that the woman he had discarded was no longer asking to be chosen. She was making choices that would outlive his pride. When the light turned green, Elise pressed her hand lightly against the window, watching her reflection fragment in the glass like a life finally splitting away from the past. And as the car rolled forward, one brutal question settled into the space between them: how long before the truth reached the children first? Rain kept tapping the city like impatient fingers against a window. In the apartment Elise had rented under a name no one in Adrian's world would bother to remember, the kettle clicked off and the silence after it felt almost sacred. A child's sock lay on the sofa arm, tiny and bright against the gray fabric, and beside it sat 3 paper cups she had never needed to explain to anyone. The kitchen smelled faintly of milk, toast, and the clean detergent she had started buying for herself, because no one here asked why she preferred the simplest things. There had been a time when every morning began with permission. A glance. A mood. A door left shut or opened on someone else's terms. Now she moved through the room with a steadiness that had been earned, not given. She dried her hands, checked the lock once, then twice, and crossed to the narrow table where a sealed envelope waited under a ceramic bowl. The courier had left it 15 minutes ago. No return address. No flourish. Just thick cream paper and a gold crest pressed so deep it caught the light when she tilted it. Elise opened it with one careful tear. The invitation inside was spare and elegant, a private charity gala at the Marrow House Hotel. The names on the guest list were not printed, but one line at the bottom made her still. 3 reserved seats. 1 family allotment. Confirmation required tonight. Her thumb held the page flat while her eyes moved over the words again, slower this time. Not a threat. Not quite. An opening. From the hall, a small voice called her name, sleepy and soft, and she folded the invitation before anyone could see the tremor in her fingers. In the bedroom, 3 matching suitcases stood by the wall, already packed with the quiet precision of someone who had learned to leave before being asked. One zipper caught on a ribbon, and she freed it without looking away from the door. This was not fear. Fear had lived here once, in the pauses between his footsteps and her own breath. What moved through her now was something colder and cleaner: readiness. She set the invitation on the table beside the cups and the child's sock, then smoothed the front of her plain sweater as if she were preparing for church instead of war. Outside, the rain thickened. Somewhere across the city, Adrian would be laughing at a table full of people who still mistook spectacle for power. Elise looked at the crest one last time, then reached for the pen. Tonight, someone had decided to call her back into the room. The invitation trembled once under the draft from the window, then lay still beside the cooling cups and the tiny sock folded at the table's edge. Elise's fingers hovered over the paper, not quite touching the crest embossed in gold. It was not fear that held her back. Fear had already done its work years ago. This was something colder, memory, with its neat hands and polished lies. The last time she had entered a room like this, she had worn a borrowed smile and swallowed every insult because peace had seemed cheaper than dignity. Tonight, the choice felt different. On the opposite wall, the cheap clock kept ticking with cruel patience, each second sounding like a door closing somewhere else in the city. Adrian was probably at a table tonight, surrounded by laughter, Crystal, and people who applauded him for surviving the wreckage he had made. Let him. Let them. She picked up the pen at last, and the metal was colder than rain. The line of her signature moved slowly, then stopped, as if the ink itself had recognized the weight of what it was sealing. Not a surrender. Not a plea. An opening. The invitation carried a crest she had never been meant to challenge, and still her name settled beneath it with a quiet finality that made the room feel smaller. Then the phone lit up. No number. No photo. Only a single message from an unknown sender: your dinner reservation is under the name Elise. The table is already expecting 3 children. The rain had thinned to a silver mist by the time Elise reached the hotel terrace, where the glass walls held the city in a soft, expensive blur. Below, the private dining room glowed like a jewelry box: warm light, white linen, and a single arrangement of lilies standing too tall for the table they guarded. A waiter in gloves stepped aside the moment her name was spoken. No hesitation. No double-checking. Just a small, practiced bow, as if the room had been waiting for her longer than anyone wanted to admit. Inside, the air smelled of sandalwood and chilled champagne. 3 place settings sat untouched, each marked with a child-sized porcelain cup that made her chest tighten on sight. Elise stopped at the threshold, one hand resting lightly against the velvet clutch at her side. The unknown message on her phone had not lied. Someone had prepared for exactly this family, exactly this number, exactly her. Across the room, a man in a dark suit rose from his chair, not rushing, not smiling too broadly, only watching her with the calm attention of someone who already knew the shape of the storm he had invited in. "You came alone," he said. It was not a question. Elise let the silence stretch until it belonged to her, then gave him a glance sharp enough to cut glass. "No," she said, and the word landed cleanly between them. One of the side doors opened. A small hand appeared first, then another, and then the 3 children stepped into the light with the careful seriousness of those who understood they were entering a room that could change their lives. The man's expression did not break, but the color left his face in a slow, controlled drain. Elise did not look at him again. She looked at the table, at the lilies, at the 3 chairs waiting exactly where they should not have been. For the first time in years, the secret she had carried like a second heartbeat stood beside her in the open air, breathing. And with it came a different kind of danger, one with polished shoes, a legal folder, and a smile that never reached the eyes. The waiter set down a sealed envelope at the center of the table and withdrew without a sound. On the front, in precise black ink, were 2 words that made the room feel suddenly, terribly narrow: paternity hearing. The envelope did not look dangerous. That was the worst thing about it. Thick cream paper. Clean edges. A court seal pressed into the flap like a quiet threat. Across from the table, Adrian's lawyer rested one hand beside it, polished nails, polished smile, polished cruelty, waiting for Elise to reach first, as if permission still belonged to him. The lilies on the terrace shifted in the wind, their pale heads nodding over the glass railing, and inside the private room the chandeliers threw a cold white sheen over every face. No one spoke. Even the cutlery seemed to hold its breath. Then Elise's fingers moved. Not fast. Not trembling. She opened the envelope and let the first page slide into the light. A hearing notice. Then another. And a third page, folded once, marked in red. Her eyes stopped on the line the lawyer had clearly expected to wound her with, a request for immediate genetic confirmation. Around the table, forks paused midair. Someone laughed once, too sharply, too late, and died into silence. Adrian leaned back in his chair, one corner of his mouth lifting as if he had finally cornered her in public. "You can sign away a marriage," he said softly, "but not biology." The words landed with the smug certainty of a man who thought blood was a weapon he owned. Elise did not answer him. She simply reached into her clutch and placed a second envelope beside his. Smaller. Heavier. Sealed with a private crest no one at that table recognized. For the first time, Adrian's smile faltered. The lawyer's eyes flicked down, then up, then down again. Elise's voice, when it came, was quiet enough to force every person in the room to lean in. "Then let the court compare names." She slid the envelope forward with 2 fingers, and the red mark on the top page caught the light like a cut. Across the terrace, the city seemed to blur and tilt, as if the entire night had just changed direction. One of the triplets had already been named in the paperwork. The question now was no longer whether the secret could survive the hearing. It was whose version of the truth would reach the judge first. The corridor outside the judge's chambers had gone unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that made every heel strike sound like a warning. Inside, the clerk was already arranging the papers in a neat stack, and Adrian's voice, smooth, controlled, impatient, cut through the door before it opened. He had come ready to win by numbers, by signatures, by making the past look small enough to fit inside a folder. Tears did not move. The envelope was still in her hand, its edge pressing into her palm, the red mark on the top page bright as a fresh wound. Across the terrace windows, the city lights blurred against the glass. No one in that room knew yet that the paper they were about to challenge had already been answered by something far more permanent: blood, birth records, and a witness who had spent years learning how to stay invisible. A server passed with a tray of untouched champagne. Somewhere behind the lawyer's back, a phone vibrated once, then twice. A message arrived, then another, each one narrowing the room around her. Not panic. Not exactly. Calculation. Adrian stepped inside first, followed by the model on his arm, all polished curves and expensive perfume. She looked at the envelope, then at Tears, and smiled with the easy cruelty of someone who had never had to survive a room like this. "Is this where you finally admit defeat?" she asked. Tears lifted her eyes, calm enough to feel dangerous. "Not defeat," she said. "Revision." The word landed before anyone understood it. The clerk hesitated. The judge's assistant glanced up from the file. And then the door opened again. This time, it was not a clerk. It was the family attorney from the trust office, carrying a sealed addendum with the kind of expression reserved for disasters disguised as paperwork. He crossed the floor, set the document beside the envelope, and said one sentence that emptied the room of air. The beneficiary designation was updated 3 months ago. Adrian's face changed first. Not fear. Recognition. The lawyer turned the page. 3 names. 1 trust. 1 line that tied the hidden children to a legacy no one had expected to survive the marriage. Tears did not smile. She only folded her hands around the envelope and waited while the room began to understand that the money was no longer the point. The point was ownership. And when the judge's door finally opened, the question was no longer whether the secret would be believed. It was whether Adrian was prepared to learn what, exactly, he had tried to bury. The judge's door opened with a soft, final click, and the corridor seemed to inhale at once. Adrian stepped out first, his jaw tight, his confidence polished thin as glass. Behind him, the clerk carried the sealed file like a verdict already delivered. Tears was still standing where the light from the high window cut a pale line across the floor, the envelope resting between her hands. No one moved. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Then Adrian's gaze fell on the document in her grip, and something in his face changed. Not fear, not yet, but the first ugly recognition that he had been standing on borrowed certainty. "What did you give him?" he asked, low enough to sound calm, sharp enough to bleed. In Tears did not answer. She simply turned the envelope once, letting the gold edge catch the light, and the silence around them grew heavier than any accusation. The clerk cleared his throat and read the order in a flat, formal voice. The financial restraints were lifted, the sealed inheritance language was admitted, and the children named in the record would be protected under trust. Adrian's model wife, waiting at the far end of the corridor in silk and perfect posture, finally took one step back. Not because she understood everything, but because she understood enough. That was the cruelest kind of revelation, one that did not need explanation to wound. Adrian took one step forward, then stopped when the judge appeared in the doorway again, holding a second paper the room had not expected. "There is one remaining condition," he said. His eyes moved from Adrian to In Tears, and the corridor sharpened around the words. "If the trust is to remain in force, the children must be acknowledged in court today." No one breathed. The model's hand tightened around her clutch. Adrian's mouth parted, but no sound came out clean. In Tears lifted her chin at last, and the small motion carried more force than any shout. It was not triumph. It was decision. The paper in her hands was no longer a secret. It was a door. And when she finally placed it against her chest, Adrian understood that burying the truth had cost him more than his marriage. It had cost him control, and control was the only thing he had ever loved well. Outside, thunder rolled once over the courthouse roof, distant and low, as if the city itself were waiting to hear whether he would speak his children's names aloud.